Hi everyone and welcome. Thanks very much for making the time to come along today to our lunchtime webinar. My name's Linda Somerville, for those that don't know me. We've still got a few people arriving on the call, so we'll just let them get set up. I'm one of the Deputy General Secretaries here at the STUC, and I'm delighted that so many folk have joined us today because we've got a really important session. I've got a few introductory comments just to make, and then I'll be passing over to our experts for today who are going to guide us through a whole load of things, and you will also have an opportunity to ask some questions, and we hope you do. We're scheduled for about 90 minutes today, which we felt was really just a bit of a starter. There's so much in this that we can go on and on, but we thought we'd give people a bit of a taster just now, and it is likely that we will be having other sessions into the autumn. We will come back to this and other subjects that are related. So the background to this, as everybody knows, is years and years and years of trade union campaigning. I mean, this legislation didn't come out of nowhere, and it certainly wasn't handed to us. It's everything that we do within our trade union movement. It's been considered, it's been carefully strategised, and we've campaigned long and hard for governments to both reverse some of the anti-trade union legislation and improve the rights that workers need, both individually and collectively. And we've now seen that. The Labour government, if there is still one by 5 o'clock, I haven't checked the news in the last hour, certainly have made many mistakes, and that's a different meeting that we can have. But, you know, on this, they have delivered, not in full, not as much as most trade unions wanted, but they have gone a long way to making really a huge difference. And they call it a generational change, and it is a generational change in employment rights in Britain. Something that takes us back in some areas to where the rest of Europe is, and in some areas still very far behind. But it does make a significant difference. We've seen these changes now being rolled out as part of the Employment Rights Bill, the Employment Rights Act. We had lots of amendments to it, a lot of consultation with unions, and even after the change in our previous Deputy Prime Minister, the government did deliver on it, and I know we were worried politically at that point that it might fall away. So we now have a whole new set of legislation that both workers and employers and unions are getting their head round. Some of that is about individual rights, some is that about collective rights, changes to your terms and conditions and to what actually can be done in the workplace and what people's contracts and what better improvements there are for them, whether it's sick pay, the right to request flexible working, etc. But one of the big areas that's coming up for us throughout this year, and particularly from October onwards, is about what is the changes for trade unions. And this is something that we know that we want to build our capacity, knowledge and skills within our union movement here in Scotland to try and support unions to navigate through this. Now, many of you are doing your own things. You'll be doing your own upskilling around it and your own training at a national level, either UK or indeed in Scotland. But we wanted to bring people together to begin to bring in experts. So we've launched a new series of events. This is the first one called Making Rights Real. Because as we all know, whether it's policy, procedure or legislation, if it just lies dormant on a bit of paper or filed away under an HR guidance, nothing changes for people. So this isn't just about looking at the legislation. We'll be moving through this later in the year to look at how do we organise around this to make sure that people can actually access what is their employment rights or indeed make them come to life for individuals and for groups of workers. So as one of the first part of this is our event today. We can tell you a bit more at the end about other events and who we'll be partnering up with in order to deliver things throughout the summer and after the summer into the autumn. But today I'm delighted that we're being partnered with ACAS, and we've got two experts with us today. We've got Matt Penfold and Marie Young, and they're both members of the ACAS Conciliation Service, and they can both tell you a little bit about their roles when I introduce them. But they're going to go through really the detail about recognition and access. And as I say, there's a lot more to it, and we'll all be finding our way through this because there's a lot in the legislation and a lot of change for unions. People have been fighting for access, fighting against employers, fighting to get recognition, all kinds of hurdles and barriers and all kinds of quotas and numbers that you had to get through. And a lot of that's changed or has disappeared altogether. So we're going to look at that in some detail. And I was going to ask if you've got any questions or comments, please stick them in the chat box and we will be looking at them later. We'll probably just take a break before we go into questions, but we're going to hear from Matt first, who's going to talk to us about recognition. So I'll hand over to you now, Matt.
Thank you very much, Linda. And just a quick check that I can be heard. Marie, if you can just give a thumbs up that everything's good. Right. Okay. Well, good afternoon, colleagues. As Linda introduced me, I'm Matt Penfold, and we've got a colleague of mine on the call as well, Aaron Kennedy. Myself and Aaron are the managers of the North team and the South team of ACAS's Collective Conciliation Service. The Collective Dispute Resolution Team is how we're referred to internally. That's about 23 people across the nations that provide services to employers and to trade unions where there is a trade dispute situation. You can use ACAS in an endeavour to try and find a resolution across the negotiating table. We would act as an independent third party. So that's enough about me. Marie will introduce herself. I will wager that there are colleagues on the call here from trade unions who have got members in workplaces where it has been very difficult to achieve recognition and get the doors open. Now, Marie and I are going to set out provisions that have been introduced through the Employment Rights Act of 2025 that should, depending on your resources, make that job a lot easier for you. So I'm going to start by talking about the changes, the amendments that have come in since April to the statutory trade union recognition process that is available to all independent trade unions. I'll also highlight the changes that are coming in from October to that same statutory recognition process. And then Marie will pick up after we've had a short break and an opportunity for you to ask me some questions around recognition. Marie will then pick up on the new right for trade unions to request accesses to workplaces. I was at a similar event yesterday, and there was an employment lawyer speaking who who highlighted to me and to the audience that the changes that have been brought in, the new rights that have come in, both individual and collective rights with the Employment Rights Act, will move the UK from currently 28th in a table of 30 countries across Europe to around midway in that table of 30. So we won't be quite as luxurious as France, but there is a significant impact that should be achieved by the Employment Rights Act. And we've chosen two areas of the Employment Rights Act that we believe will bring us further work and will create opportunities for trade union colleagues as well. So, without further ado, I've got some slides I'm going to share, and I suspect it'll take around 40 minutes or so, maybe slightly less, for me to deliver the content of these slides. Then we'll take a short break and some questions on recognition before we hand over to Marie. So, let me get my slides shared for you. And again, I'll just look for some confirmation from a thumbs up from any video that these are now in front of you. I can see that they are. Thank you, Linda. Right. Okay. So as Linda said, making rights real, and some content for you on recognition and the access rights. Oh, I don't need to I don't need to read anything out from that slide, but I do want to point out the caveat at the bottom. Yeah. The amendments to legislation, okay, so a lot of them are already in from the Employment Rights Act since April. Some came in even before that, amendments to industrial action law. And the government has published an implementation timetable, but I think many of us already seen that can be a little bit of a moving feast. So please view the content that I'm delivering and these slides, which you'll be given a copy of, as having a health warning on them. There's a caveat that they could only be viewed as being current on the 13th of May when they're being delivered, in case something changes from tomorrow. So that's very much an encouragement to watch this space on the content that I'm going to be talking about. Those of you that may not have worked with Marie in the past, or Jane, who is also on our call. Jane and Marie are part of the Collective Dispute Resolution Service at ACAS. ACAS has got a general duty in legislation to promote the improvement of industrial relations, and that includes offering our services, offering Jane and Marie's services in Scotland to act as an independent, impartial third party at the negotiating table where unions and employers agree to use them. Yeah. And that is a voluntary step that unions and employers can take in any trade dispute situation. You could invite in Jane or Marie as a third party to help you close the gap that you have with an employer on a particular issue. So there's no charge for that service because we receive central government funding to make that service available. That way, neither side of the table ends up seeing an invoice, and our impartiality is not conflicted at all. Those unions and employers that do decide to use ACAS in a trade dispute situation, there's an outright resolution or at least progress made in 90% of the cases that we are engaged in. Now, a lot of that is over to the attitude of the trade union and the employer. The very fact that you're using ACAS, using a third party, indicates that everybody desires the reaching of a resolution. So the 90% isn't because we have a magic wand, it's because you have decided that using a third party might be of value. 90% proves it is. Okay, so the Employment Rights Act, part of Labour's plan to make work pay. Majority of the provisions in the Employment Rights Act do apply in England, Scotland and Wales. Northern Ireland is slightly behind the curve. They were consulting on a Good Jobs Employment Rights Bill that's currently stalled in the Northern Ireland Assembly. What relevance that may have to you as an individual, I don't know, but I just thought I would share that information. The overall aim of the Employment Rights Act, as Linda was saying, is to try to bring in some balance to the industrial table, to reset and modernise United Kingdom's industrial relations framework. So let's talk about what the modernising and the changes look like in terms of statutory trade union recognition. I have no way of knowing how many of the of my colleagues in the audience on this webinar, how many of you have sought recognition of an employer. But I just want to paint a bit of a picture before I start delving into too much detail. So unions can collectively bargain efficiently with employers in respect of groups of workers where recognition exists, because recognition is an agreement between that employer and that trade union that certain terms and conditions of a group of workers, usually described in very specific terms such as the warehouse workers or the transport division, the terms and conditions of a group of workers, which I'll now refer to as a bargaining unit, can be determined through collective bargaining. And that's easily done if you have a recognition agreement, because recognition agreements will set out what the procedures will be for the union and the employer to be engaging throughout the year, when the union would be presenting a pay and other terms and conditions improvement claim, or sometimes when the employer will share the proposal with the union. There is no right or wrong to the starting point, but typically unions share the pay claim. So recognition is something that by and large is achieved voluntarily, following a union's request to an employer. But if the employer says no, you will, I believe, be aware that there is a statutory procedure available to all independent trade unions that can be used to resolve that request for recognition. So if you've been knocked back by an employer having sought recognition, it is open to the union to make an application to a body called the Central Arbitration Committee. And the Central Arbitration Committee has a judicial function. It decides on whether or not a trade union will be recognised by an employer, and it makes that decision by going through a sequence of assessments and written formal decisions before concluding at the end of the process whether or not the union gets recognition. Now, a quick point to flag up about statutory trade union recognition is if you made an application to the Central Arbitration Committee and were successful, you achieved recognition, what that would look like is that the Central Arbitration Committee would issue a declaration that would say the union is recognised for the purposes of collective bargaining on, and it would be limited to 3 core issues: pay and hours and holidays. That's all the CAC can impose on an employer when it comes to the issues for collective bargaining: pay and hours and holidays. So the CAC if you were successful with your application, would make that declaration. And then it would be for the union and the employer to work out, okay, so when and on what frequency are we going to engage with each other? What arrangements will there be for the number of reps that we'll have in the workplace? What is going to be our approach to requests for facilities time? What will be our approach if we find ourselves in dispute? What's our dispute resolution procedure? So all the things that you would typically see in a voluntary recognition agreement, that's still left to the employer and the union to work through that drafting. All the CAC declares is you, the union, are recognised in respect of that bargaining unit for pay, hours and holidays negotiations. If it proves that you couldn't reach that collective bargaining agreement, that method of bargaining with the employer, the setting out of how we're going to do it following a CAC declaration, you can, either the employer or the union or both together, go back to the CAC and say, look, we're struggling here. We can't set out our procedures in writing. Can you please impose those as well? So that's available through the CAC. But there I'm trying to paint a picture of the end, the successful endpoint, as far as a trade union is concerned, of the statutory recognition procedure. There are other decisions that need to be made at the CAC. So the first decision the CAC will make when it receives your application form, because it's only a trade union that will apply for recognition. When the CAC receives your application form, it will apply a number of tests. One of the first tests it will apply is, did the union, first of all, make a request to the employer and give the employer a chance to consider voluntarily entering a recognition arrangement? Because the law doesn't want unions simply popping applications into the CAC and then an employer saying, well, I didn't know that they wanted that. I would have sat down and talked about it. So there is a requirement in the legislation that governs the statutory recognition procedures, which is referred to as, well, it's named, it's not referred to as, it's called Schedule A1 to the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act of 1992. So all the CAC's considerations, what it's allowed to do and what it must do, are set out in that schedule. So in the schedule, one of the very first tests is, did the union send a valid request to the employer? And by valid, the CAC will be told that it needs to see that the union said it has a certificate of independence, that it's asking the employer to agree recognition, and that it's making this request under Schedule A1 of the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act. Now, the idea of writing that into law was that that would enable an employer to go and look up that legislation and see what the path ahead might look like if you, the union, do end up applying to the CAC. So it's a fair warning given to the employer. So the valid request would need to name the employer, name the union, state that the union has a certificate of independence. It would need to describe the bargaining unit so the employer knows who you want to achieve collective bargaining for, and it would need to reference the existence of Schedule A1 to TORA 92. So that's a very first test that the CAC applies. But if it ticks that box, then it won't accept your application straight away. It will move on to its other tests. And its other tests would include, okay, well, look, the union is applying for recognition in respect of the warehouse workers at this company. Let's make sure that there's no other union already recognised for the warehouse workers. So there is that overlap test that's applied by the Central Arbitration Committee before it will accept an application. It will ask the question, is any other union recognised for one or more of the workers that fall in the applicant union's bargaining unit? If it's not, the path ahead is clear. That box is ticked again. If there is existing recognition for covering one or more of the workers in your chosen bargaining unit, then the CAC would reject your application, because the CAC, the legislation was written deliberately to avoid conflicts between unions, or the CAC trying to sort such conflicts out. So I think, fortunately in Scotland, you have the clearinghouse arrangement. So that sort of stumbling block in a CAC application shouldn't present a problem. So that's one of the admissibility tests, if you like. Whether the CAC is going to accept this application is preceded by a lot of tests being applied. One of the next tests will be, okay, this union that is applied to the CAC for statutory recognition, does it have at least 10% of its chosen bargaining unit as members? Yeah, so there's a membership level test. The membership level test now is 10%. Can the union show it's got 10%? Any of you that had previously used the statutory recognition procedures before the changes from April may also have been aware that there was, and there is no more, but there was also a test of, are the majority of the workers in that bargaining unit likely to support the union? And unions would often pass around a petition to the workers within its chosen bargaining unit and ask them to sign to say that they do support the particular union achieving recognition with the employer. Those petitions were passed around because the CAC had the old test of, does the union have 10% in membership, but also can the union provide some evidence that shows a majority of the workers in the bargaining unit would support its pursuit of recognition. That majority likely to test is gone. So you don't, unless you want to, unless you think it will be impactful in terms of trying to get the employer involved in voluntary dialogue, there is no requirement for CAC procedures for you to present a petition as part of a Central Arbitration Committee application for recognition. If you can show the 10% membership, then your application is likely at that point to be accepted as admissible by the CAC. That, let me highlight, is a first decision of a number of available decisions in the statutory process. So it's just saying the CAC are embracing your application and saying, yes, this has some merit. We're going to give it further considerations under Schedule A1. And those further considerations would include, because at the acceptance stage, it's only the union that wrote down all the warehouse workers are the appropriate bargaining unit. The CAC would take that at face value for the purpose of deciding whether to accept as admissible an application. But later on, the next decision, the next key decision the CAC makes is, has the union put forward an appropriate bargaining unit? So the CAC will want to hear from the employer, and the employer may say, warehouse workers alone, that's not an appropriate bargaining unit. If it was warehouse workers and transport, maybe that, in our view as an employer, would be a more appropriate bargaining unit. And the CAC would need to take that into account when determining the final bargaining unit for the further considerations it will need to make. So there's an acceptance decision. Then there's a decision on whether the bargaining unit is appropriate for the purposes of collective bargaining in the future. Once that is locked down, once there is a settled bargaining unit at play, then the CAC's next decision would be, do we need to hold a ballot of the workers in this bargaining unit in order to decide the question of whether the union is recognised? Now, the CAC doesn't have to hold a ballot if you, the union, have a majority of the bargaining unit as members. So anything north of 50% in terms of membership in the bargaining unit will give the CAC the ability to say, you're declared recognised. But of course, the CAC will seek the views of the employer on that. And also, if you don't have majority membership, the CAC cannot simply declare you recognised. It will have to hold a ballot, which would either be workplace or postal. Or in January 2027 onwards, it is expected that the CAC for statutory recognition ballots will be able to use email votes. Okay, so there's a quick picture of the key decisions in the Central Arbitration Committee's statutory recognition legislation and procedures. So the CAC will be tasked with deciding if it has to those types of questions. But voluntarism is baked in throughout Schedule A1. There are references to, if an application is accepted as admissible by the CAC, well, we know the next step is going to be, is the bargaining unit appropriate? The CAC will give the employer and the union the chance to just go away and agree the appropriate bargaining unit. And if they can't agree it through their negotiations, then they can both go back to the CAC and say, we tried, no luck, please you decide, CAC, you decide the bargaining unit. So voluntarism is baked in. My personal experience in 20 years of working with employers and trade unions on recognition questions is that the majority of applications that end up at the CAC end up dropping out of the CAC and entering the world of voluntary negotiation. That's my experience. The minority of cases stay under the watchful eye of the CAC and end up with the CAC having to make its full range of decisions. So the full range of decisions is my next slide. I was trying to paint a bit of an overview picture before I showed this slide because it's chock full of the table. Down the left-hand column, I've put in the current and future available CAC decision stages. And down the right-hand column, I've tried to specify how the Employment Rights Act has either introduced something new or has amended something that existed before. So let's pick the first one. Whether to accept the application, that's a decision the CAC will make, which I was referring to as admissibility, which included that did the union make the request to the employer in the first place and give the employer a chance to look up the law and see what it might end up dealing with. So that's part of the acceptance decision. What changes have there been to the CAC's acceptance decision? Well, it's the one I mentioned. Now, there is not a requirement for a union to show that the majority of the workers in the bargaining unit support it. All it has to show now, since the 6th of April, is that it has 10% of the bargaining unit as members within its own rules. Yeah, I've got 10% membership. There's no other numerical test there. So that's a change that came in. Now, I mentioned that the next stage, the next step after an acceptance decision, the next key decision the CAC would make would be, is the bargaining unit appropriate? You can already see I've inserted something in between those two at the moment. But let me just pick up on the bargaining unit appropriateness. I mentioned that the CAC, if they accept an application from a union, will then say, we've accepted it, why don't you have a negotiation and see if you can agree what the appropriate bargaining unit would be. Now, if you and the employer go away and you do agree a bargaining unit and it's not the same as the one you'd articulated in your application form to the CAC, so if it shifts from your initial application said warehouse workers, but through negotiation you've agreed with the employer, okay, yeah, warehouse workers and transport is now actually the appropriate bargaining unit. We've all agreed that. If you go back to the CAC, you need to picture that the CAC are now dealing with a different description of a bargaining unit and a different number of people likely to be in it. So they will reapply their acceptance tests to that new bargaining unit. But the only change will be that, well, it's not really a change. Majority likely to will not be applied at that point either. All you'll have to show in warehouse and transport is that you still have 10% membership, because if you don't, at that point the CAC would reject your application on the basis that the numerical threshold set out in legislation is not met. So now to the second entry, the physical access request. I mentioned the CAC may end up ordering a ballot of all the workers in order to decide whether the union gets recognition. Now, if there is a ballot, the union only gets access to workers in a physical sense. It can only go into the workplace and meet the workers during the ballot period. It can't go in following the acceptance of the application. It can't go in following the determination of the bargaining unit. It can only go in if a CAC ballot is ordered. Well, that changes in October. From October, if you make an application to the Central Arbitration Committee and it's accepted, at that point, you can say to the CAC and to the employer, right, we would now like to have physical access to the workers. We want to go in, start campaigning, start recruiting, start building a swell of support for our recognition application earlier on in the process. So that will be available to a union outside of the ballot stages and immediately following acceptance of the application. That will be available. That provision doesn't come in until October. And one word of warning, when that provision does come in, the CAC will only give you the opportunity to ask for that access for the 5 working days following telling you that your application is accepted. If you wait longer, the physical access route will be shut down. So there'll be a time scale on that one. Bargaining unit appropriateness. The CAC decides an appropriate bargaining unit by considering the characteristics of the workers in the proposed bargaining unit, um, the desirability of avoiding small and fragmented bargaining units, the employer's existing arrangements for amending terms and conditions for that bargaining unit, and also the employer's views on the appropriateness of the bargaining unit. There was no change from April or October in how the CAC assesses the appropriateness of a bargaining unit. Whether a ballot should be held, okay, I've said if you've got majority membership in a bargaining unit, the CAC could declare you recognised with no need for a ballot, but they will ask the employer's views. If you've got less than majority membership, there will always be a CAC ballot. And the form of that ballot, as I said, workplace, postal, or a mix of the two, or from 2027, email ballots. Some of you may have heard of unfair practices. During a CAC ballot, right now, there is an extra obligation on both the union and the employer not to engage in any unfair practice. Now, an unfair practice is set out in very complex legal language in Schedule A1. But for the purposes of us all understanding what might be being referred to, no bribes, no threats that are designed to influence the outcome of the ballot. So the employer can't start offering people what was called in legislation outcome-specific offers based on whether or not the union achieved recognition. So that's a jurisdiction that the CAC only has during a ballot stage at the moment. Yeah. From October, the unfair practices overwatch, the ability to make a complaint about what the other side of the table has done, that was clearly designed to influence the progress of the recognition application, that will apply from the acceptance stage. So from the point at which an application is accepted by the CAC, saying you've got 10%, you made a valid request, there's no other union recognised, we'll accept your application for the further considerations. From that point onwards, any misbehaviours and misdemeanours can be complained about, and if upheld by the CAC, and not rectified in line with the CAC's orders, can lead to the abandoning of the process under the CAC at that point, and declaration of recognition being issued if it's the employer that transgressed, or a declaration that you're not recognised if somehow the trade union transgressed. Okay, it's enough on unfair practices. Ballots. A CAC ballot, if it orders a ballot to decide the question of recognition, then before April, just behind us, before April, there was a very complex double threshold that you, the union, had to achieve to secure recognition. That double threshold has now been simplified. All you need to secure recognition through the CAC, if a ballot is held now, is a straight majority of those voting, not a majority of the bargaining unit, a majority of the turnout. Yeah, so if it's 100 people in a bargaining unit, 3 people vote, 2 of them vote in your favour, the CAC will declare you recognised. The final row here in the 2 columns is the method of bargaining. That is a decision point that the CAC really has to use. It's where it declares a union recognised and the union and employer fail to be able to put together a draft collective bargaining agreement. Yeah, they can't set out the sort of numbers of reps, facilities, dispute resolution procedures, etc. So they can go back to the CAC and say, can you impose a method of bargaining on us that we can work to? Yeah. If you get there, I feel sorry for you because it's a very limited and very prescriptive method of bargaining. Yeah. It won't create the richness of collective relations and collective bargaining activity that one would think both a union and an employer would want to aspire to. So those are the changes in CAC decision making. I've just set that table out in some words here. So just a 10% test now, no majority likely support. There is an entry in the Employment Rights Act that says that a government, if it consults with stakeholders, could drop the percentage test to as low as 2%. Okay, I can't see that ever happening, but it's a regulation that exists. You would know it if any government intended to drop the membership requirement. CAC ballots need a simple majority. And the fourth bullet point on the slide that you're looking at, it blocked a bit of a loophole that existed in previous legislation, blocked it to an extent. So once a union, your independent trade union that you work for, has made a valid request to an employer, so that's that initial request that the CAC would look for if you made an application eventually. A valid statutory request landing on employer's table will mean that if that employer then ran out and reached a slightly aromatic arrangement with a non-independent trade union, that won't matter as far as your application is concerned. You could still put your application into the CAC. The CAC will still make all of its decisions, and you may still be declared recognised by the CAC. The CAC would ignore the existence of the employer's arrangement with a non-independent trade union. Okay, so the employer ends up with a problem there. It's recognised a non-independent trade union, thinking that would lock the door on you. It has not, because you'd already made your request. So the employer now ends up with both statutory recognition on pay hours and holidays with you, plus whatever it's promised to do with the non-independent trade union. This is the blocking of a loophole. From October 2026, there will be an additional provision coming live into the statutory recognition procedures. From the point an application form from the trade union is received by the CAC, so picture you made a request to the employer, valid request. The employer said, no, not interested. So you have to make an application to the CAC if you want to secure recognition or embark on a trade dispute. Of course, that is another option that's open. If the employer has rejected you and you do make an application to the CAC, then the day that your application form lands on the CAC's desk, there is the freezing of the identities of all the workers in your proposed bargaining unit. So your application said, we want recognition for the warehouse workers. When the CAC gets your application form, it will freeze the identities of the workers in that bargaining unit. And it will say to the employer, okay, the union is seeking recognition for warehouse workers. We'll get to deciding if that's an appropriate group at some point. But right now, the duty on the employer is to give the CAC the name, the date of birth, the category of worker, which I think would just be the job role description, to the CAC within 5 days of the CAC telling the employer it's received an application from the union. Now, if that sounded complex, picture yourself in the employer's chair. The union made an application to the CAC, and the CAC will write out to the employer and ask it various questions, an employer response form. One of the new questions it will ask is, please can you send us the details of all the people that currently work in the warehouse? That's because those people will be the only people we will class as being relevant when we apply our 10% test. And if we get to a ballot, those will be the only people that will be allowed to vote in the ballot. That's why the CAC needs to know exactly who they are. Doesn't mean an employer can't recruit into the warehouse. It doesn't mean a worker can't leave their job. Yeah. But for the purposes of any future ballot, obviously leavers wouldn't be included, but joiners would not be allowed to vote in the ballot, so that everybody can be assured an employer cannot flood the bargaining unit in order to defeat a statutory recognition application. Okay, and as I said, physical access to the workers in the bargaining unit will be requestable. That's not a real word. You'll be able to request physical access to the workers in the bargaining unit from the point at which the CAC says, we are accepting formally this application. I mentioned unfair practices, so I'll jump to where do we think this stands? Well, I hope that it will be welcomed by independent trade unions. It may be challenging for employers, okay? Employers going to say, oh, those thresholds, those hurdles, they've all lowered, yeah? Isn't it now easier for a trade union to get recognition? The answer is yes, which, if I'm speaking to an employer, will allow me to say, though, Therefore, okay, if you think that with a statutory application, the writing is pretty much on the wall, what's the harm in getting into some voluntary dialogue? And ACAS could be used for that voluntary dialogue, because we got a lot of experience in recognition talks that is designed to get to a voluntarily agreed recognition agreement. And you are free to step out of, even temporarily, ask the CAC to pause their considerations if you think there are meaningful negotiations that can be had with colleagues from the employer on the other side of the table. So a likely upturning recognition request, well, we're already seeing that, and we're already seeing more applications going into the Central Arbitration Committee. Whether some trade unions have saved some up because the lower hurdles will make the path a lot easier to glide along, I'm not privy to that. Okay, but subject to trade union resources, of course, I think we're all going to see an uplift in recognition work, both for the CAC, for trade unions. More employers are going to be on your radar, and of course, an uplift in the work for you. I also think the changes in the statutory recognition regime will have a bleed across into voluntary discussions. So you now, as trade union officers, you will know the only expectation to get a CAC application expected in terms of numbers will be, I got to show I got 10% membership. So if in voluntary talks an employer asks me to show something more than that, I have now got the option of saying, well, I wouldn't get asked for that at the CAC. Is that what you want me to do? Make an application to the CAC? Yeah. Also in ACAS ballots, I think unions are likely to say, well, our expectation is a straight majority, because that's what would happen at the CAC. Physical access. You may be involved in some recognition voluntary discussions with an employer, and quite early on now, you'll be aware, why not ask for physical access to the workers to start doing a bit of campaigning? I'd get that at the CAC if they accepted my application. So I think we're going to all see variance in the voluntary arena as following really on from those changes in the statute. Okay, we are here to help everybody navigate this new landscape. Jane and Marie, I know personally, have got a long track record now in recognition discussions and other trade disputes. So they would be a safe port of call, even if you just wanted to have a confidential conversation with them about a situation you're dealing with. Nobody in ACAS, Jane nor Marie, are picking up the phone to the employer that you might reference. Okay, that's not the way we work. So whether you're calling us for the third-party assistance and we actually join you and the employer at the table, or if you just want to talk things through confidentially about what might be doable, please feel free to pick up the phone. That is the end of my slide, so I'm going to stop sharing at that point, and thank you for bearing with me. Now, I think it was proposed that we might take a short break.
Yeah,
Linda?
thanks very much, Matt. That was excellent. There's a lot in there. It's taken us a little while, I think, to get our heads around it.
To absorb,
So,
yep.
yeah, I'm hoping people have got questions. We've kept everybody on the call, which is great. So I'm just going to ask people to take a quick 5-minute break, no longer than that, and we'll jump straight back into the next session where we'll take some questions. Hopefully people can put them in the chat, and we will move on to beyond that into access. So speak to you all soon. Thank you.
Hi everyone, just welcome back and bring everyone back in. Matt, if you don't mind, Linda is having some technical difficulties, but she will join us.
Back.
You're back? You're back. Okay, that saves me having to jump in then.
Uh-huh.
I did ask
Hi,
for any
everyone.
questions. Yep.
Yep, okay. So, Sean, how would you like to do this? Do you want me to just read through the questions? There only seem to be a couple in my Q&A panel.
Yes. And
yes.
Just
okay.
invite everyone. Just while we're talking, just add any more questions to the Q&A section of the Teams app, and I'll maybe drop a few in as well.
Okay. All right. So if I can see that Paul has asked the question, will trade union membership status be frozen at application to the CAC? I work in an organisation where we've got more than 50% locally, but less than 10% nationally, and the employer insists, this is going to be a long one, is it? Insists local bargaining unit isn't suitable. A CAC application could encourage membership at other sites, particularly if the trade union can enter the workplace. Okay, and you're leaving it 2, Paul. Right. Okay, so I'll answer the bits I can. Will trade union membership status be frozen at the point of the application to the CAC? No, only the identities of the workers in the bargaining unit. The CAC will at some point get around to working out what the membership level is in that bargaining unit. That's the point at which you might say, okay, well, for all intents and purposes, it's probably frozen now because the CAC are doing the maths. Yeah. So will trade union membership status be frozen at the point of your application? No. The CAC will typically conduct a membership check if an employer says, we don't know what the union's membership level is. The CAC will conduct a membership check. That's a snapshot in time. So as long as you've got 10%, the application would still likely be accepted, barring any other problems. The next time that the CAC would inquire about the level of membership would be when they're deciding whether to hold a ballot. So at that point, a union might say, okay, well, since you accepted the application, we've actually recruited loads of members. We got north of 50% now, and the CAC would work on that real-time info. Obviously, they would double check the membership level by doing a fresh membership check. Yeah, I think that might be the best I can do in terms of answering your question there, Paul. In terms of what you've gone on to, you said that the employer insists the local bargaining unit isn't suitable. Right. Okay. Well, that's not the first decision the CAC would make. You could make an application to the CAC based on your preferred bargaining unit. That application would be assessed for acceptance on the basis of your bargaining unit. But the next decision stage would be, is that bargaining unit appropriate? So the CAC may end up having to decide the bargaining unit if you and the employer can't agree it. And if the employer's saying national and you're saying local, you probably won't be able to agree it. So it'd be for you to make the arguments in front of the CAC and see if you can get your local one or the employer gets its national one. One other thing I'd add there, Paul, because you've got 1 minute left. If the CAC did decide it was the national one, at that point, you could back away from the application because you will recognise we haven't got the numbers for the national bargaining unit. We'll therefore withdraw our application and work on getting the numbers up and then go back later for that bigger bargaining unit. You won't face a 3-year lockout. That really is the end of my answer to Paul's question.
Thanks very much, Matt. There's quite a lot in that. There's a couple of others in there, so we'll just move on to the next one from Caitlin.
I can't see the others. Oh, yes, sorry, new posts.
Yeah.
I see.
I'll read this one out
from
for everyone in
Caitlin.
case anyone's on their phone. So could an employer, once written to by a trade union, start recognition with another trade union to block another trade union from being recognised? It's a scenario that many people have had.
Blunt answer, if it's an independent trade union that the employer enters that agreement with, that last minute agreement, that would prevent the CAC road being travelled by the union that's made the request. Yeah. What is stopped is once that an employer has been written to by the trade union, if the employer reaches an agreement with a non-independent trade union, so that's any union that doesn't have a certificate of independence, that can no longer block the CAC process. Yeah. Okay. But if the employer, and I'll pick 2 well-known unions that I am absolutely know have got certificates of independence. You've got the GMB and you've got Unite. Yeah. If Unite writes to the employer and says, we'd like to start talking about recognition, and the employer decides, actually, I'm now reaching an agreement with the GMB, that will block an application to the CAC. The CAC will get the application and see that the employer already recognises an independent trade union if it's for the same group of workers. Yeah. Okay, so that was Caitlin.
We've got a question here which came from Ryan, which says, in regards to recognition, how long can the process take? That's interesting, because should it be speedier? We would hope it is now, but who knows?
I would hope it will be now. I would hope it would be speedier now. Usually the typical, if the CAC runs its process from cradle to grave, it will need to make an acceptance decision. then it would need to make a bargaining unit decision, but it would have given the employer and the union a chance to talk that through and see if they can negotiate it first. Once a bargaining unit is settled, either by a CAC decision or by negotiation, the CAC then has to decide whether to hold a ballot. So if you've got majority membership as a union in the settled bargaining unit, that can be the end of that process. So it could, in theory, add a bit more detail there. The CAC want to take everybody's views into account. So when they receive your application form, they want to write to the employer and ask the employer a range of different questions. It's called the employer response form. And they'll give the employer a week to send that back. The employer may ask for a bit more time. So from your application landing on the CAC's desk to the employer response coming in might be 2 weeks. And then the CAC will have to do a membership check to satisfy itself there's 10% membership. So it will give both the union and the employer a number of days to get their respective lists into the CAC. So maybe think about that might be a week added on before you get the membership check report. And then the CAC panel has to write an acceptance decision. So that can sometimes take a week, 2 weeks before it will finalise that drafting. So just to get to acceptance, you could be looking at 5 or 6 weeks. Yeah, you could be looking at that. And then the CAC, if they accepted the application, would say, well, now we'll give the employer and the union 20 working days to see if you can negotiate the bargaining unit. So there's another almost 3 weeks baked in for a negotiation period. And it's only if the union comes back and says, look, we tried, but they're not negotiating meaningfully, or we've tried and we've both agreed we're not going to reach an agreement on this. It's only in those circumstances that the CAC would shorten those 20 days and move to deciding a bargaining unit. It'll only decide a bargaining unit once it's got the employer's views and the union's views in a form of a submission in. It will hold a digital hearing as well. So that comes down to the diaries of the tribunal as they work as a tribunal. Once a bargaining unit is decided, so you might be looking at 8, 9 weeks, 10 weeks potentially before a bargaining unit is decided. And then if a ballot is going to be ordered, there'll be a 2-week delay before that's ordered, and there'll be a 20-day balloting period. Some applications can take 6 months or more. Yeah. Some applications where they are very straightforward and there's not a great deal of resistance from the employer, some applications can be through in the space of 2.5, 3 months, yeah, ending with that resolution of either the union is recognised or something has gone wrong and the union is not recognised. Yeah. So it can be a moving feast, Ryan. There's no guarantees. The only guarantee I could give you is that voluntary dialogue, whether you're using ACAS or not, voluntary dialogue is usually going to be quicker than the CAC process, and it's going to be more positive and constructive.
Okay, thank you for that. This one might be a quicker answer. Do you need to have 10% membership within the bargaining unit before requesting the 5-day access?
You will not have an application accepted unless you have 10% membership in the bargaining unit, and it's only from the point an application is accepted that those 5 days would kick in. So the answer is yes.
Thank you. And the next one, if you've recently become the largest union in the workplace, but an existing union is recognised and the employer refuses to agree to a second union recognition, is there anything that can be done?
Well, there is nothing that can be done through the Central Arbitration Committee. If there is another independent trade union recognised, then you have to live with that and either negotiate a resolution that all parties are happy with, so perhaps sort of single table bargaining or new delineations of the bargaining unit. You know, each union carves out where its target audience is, well, what its natural bargaining unit is. But that's not always going to be easy because unions will simply, generalist unions will have membership in the same grouping. They'll have members in the warehouse. Yeah, both of them. So I think that an answer there is either there's a fallout between the unions, and that might also include a fallout between the existing recognised union and the employer. So recognition or not recognition of unions is a lawful basis for a trade dispute. So the already recognised union might say, well, we've got a trade dispute with you, Mr. or Mrs. Employer, because you are now recognising someone else. It's a recognition dispute, and you will face some potential industrial action from us if you carry on down that path. Okay. Awkward and not fun for the employer either. And not fun for the two full-time officers of each union that are therefore having to find ways of engaging with each other. The clearinghouse agreement, Chris, it's an agreement I'm aware of that's operated. I think it's potentially by committee at STUC. Quite what the rules are, I don't know, but the intention, the concept is that if unions are giving intel to STUC, to the clearinghouse committee, if I call it that, Linda will call it something else, then there can be a bit of a checking process done about whether or not you're targeting a workplace that maybe STUC is already aware a different union has been working on. Yeah, or potentially in the future, you're requesting access to a workplace where STUC knows another union has already got recognition. And I think clearinghouse agreement, the way I understand it, is it's designed to, as far as possible, manage the risk of two unions coming into conflict with each other. Yeah,
Yeah, that's right.
because of pure ignorance of each other's presence somewhere.
Yeah, so basically we have, Chris, for each union, we have a contact and we refresh that every year. Unions can contact us at any time it changes, which is the main person we contact about clearing, just every year to kind of send it all out again and make sure it's still the same contact. So if a union basically wants a clear run at a site, before that, they can contact us to say, are there any other unions that you're aware of there? We'll write to the unions that we think might have had an interest in that site now or in the past and find out. So that's really as simple as it is. Part of our ongoing discussion over the summer around all of this, we might look to renew, refresh, kind of relaunch that in a slightly different way, but that's what it is, yeah.
And I think you're the pathfinders for England there as well, because I believe TUC has seen the wisdom of that process.
Yeah. Couple of questions that we can take and then we'll move on. So at what stage is the most useful to engage ACAS during the recognition process? It's a bit I suppose, voting. Vote early and vote often. So I'm going to say that's the answer, Matt.
I think everybody knows what I'm going to say there. I would say that very early on, there is no need to be notifying ACAS or the CAC when you want to approach an employer for recognition. But also, there's no harm in maybe talking through with Jane or Marie the fact that you are going to do that and agreeing whether or not you can name drop them as a port of call for the employer should they wish to take some independent advice from ACAS about how the recognition request might get resolved. Because I alluded to, on the back of one of my slides, the fact that ACAS can, if both the union and the employer ask us, we can conduct a membership check. So we would conduct a membership check by having a list of employees from the employer and a list of members from the union. We would not cross-copy them. We would keep them confidential to us. Yeah. So an employer would never see your list of members. We do a comparison and produce a numerical report if that is going to help the recognition discussions. So I'm picturing the employer saying, well, I'm sorry, Chris, I don't even know what your membership level is, and I'm not going to accept your it's significant. I need something more than that. Yeah. Well, we could use ACAS to run a membership check. And that might then persuade the employer there is a need to stay at this table and continue talking about voluntary recognition because I've now seen Chris's numbers and I know Chris could go to the CAC if Chris wanted to. As a next step, it might be, if the appetite was there from the union and the employer, that if negotiation didn't close the deal straight away on the back of, well, we've shown you we've got this membership level, will you recognise us? If it's no, not on that basis, ACAS could run a ballot as well. CAC can run its statutory recognition ballots. We could run a voluntary recognition ballot where all the workers in the bargaining unit would be asked, do you want that union recognised for collective bargaining? We'd agree a terms of reference before running such a ballot, and everyone would commit to honouring the outcome of that ballot. Yeah. At what stage is it most useful? As as early as you like. When it comes to CAC applications, if you haven't engaged with ACAS at all and you have put a CAC application in, I find that employers are most flexible, most willing to engage once they've seen the application accepted at the CAC. Yeah, that acceptance decision will signal to an employer, right, well, they're going to move on and start deciding the bargaining unit potentially. I need to maybe get my hands back in control of this as far as I can, not leave it all to a judicial body. Let's sit down with the union and see what we could both live with. Yeah, so I think the acceptance decision is often quite critical at the CAC.
Thank you. And then the last question just for now, it says, employers currently recognise more than one trade union, for example, local government, the NHS. Can one trade union block others from being recognised with these changes? So similar question to we had before, and obviously the difference is where you've got multiple unions already recognised, then that recognition stays. I think John's question is maybe about if another trade union comes along. So it's
Okay.
maybe just similar to you answered earlier, and then we'll move on
It's
to Marie.
similar, but
Thank you.
there's more in it. So I'll just attempt a quickish answer. Okay. This is about the art of what's possible in industrial relations. Okay. If we talk about the Central Arbitration Committee, the Central Arbitration Committee will not proceed with an application if another independent trade union is recognised. So with respect to this question, one independent trade union recognised by their NHS employer would prevent all those other unions from ever using the CAC to get recognition. What it could not prevent is a lawful trade dispute by any of those other trade unions. Yeah. So, and it would be a very foolish employer that decided, okay, well, I'll just pick my favourite union and we'll cast the others aside, because you're not casting anyone aside. You're simply creating a problem that's joining you on the entry ramp a little bit down the road. Yeah.
Okay, Matt, that's excellent. Thank you. Hopefully that's helped everybody with those questions. I think they cover a lot of bases and that we've all had experiences of, and not that I'm suggesting employers sometimes try and pick unions off against the others, but it's our job, yes, to try and make sure that those conversations can be had across unions also when necessary. I'm now going to call in Marie, who's at ACAS as well and based in Scotland, so she's one of our contacts. And Marie's going to talk us through what we've touched on already, but is much more importantly around the actual access. Once you get to that point, what are your rights about access and what's changed? So on you go, Marie. I think we've got about 10 minutes or so for that, and then we will look for, if you've got any questions, again, stick them in the chat and we'll hopefully still wind up on time. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks very much, Linda. Thanks to everybody for joining us today and to the STUC for hosting this webinar. My name, as Linda says, is Marie Young, and I'm one of the collective conciliators here in Scotland. We're a team of two, so it's just myself and my colleague Jane Fleming who cover the whole of Scotland. So we'd be happy to hear from you. I'll share my details and our details at the end of our slides here. I'm just going to share some slides and we'll get going. I'm mindful of time, so I'll try not to be a typical Glaswegian and rattle through. But there we go. Can everybody see that okay? Just shout out a yes, anyone?
Yeah, that's fine.
Perfect, thanks, Linda. Okay, so we're looking at trade union rights of access. So the trade union rights of access are due in October this year. It's an entirely new, never before seen and a standalone right for any independent trade union to request physical and/or digital access to workers at any UK workplace, Great Britain, Scotland, England and Wales. It's completely new territory for the world of industrial relations. Under the current legislative framework, unions do not have an independent right of access to workplaces and can only exercise their functions through individual members in the workplace or through access arrangements reached on a voluntary basis with an employer. And I guess that's problematic where membership is limited, that limits the scope for collective bargaining and for trade unions to exercise their functions of negotiation and dispute resolution. So this new right opens the door for trade unions and employers to enter into access agreements for trade union officials to access the workforce for specific reasons. And those reasons are for meeting, representing, recruiting or organising workers, or facilitating collective bargaining, but it does not extend to organising industrial action. There is an exemption on the rights to access within organisations where there are less than 21 workers employed overall. Access agreements should be notified to the Central Arbitration Committee, or the CAC, and they will keep these on record. The CAC can determine applications if no agreement is reached, and can determine whether breach of access agreements have occurred, and can look at potential remedies and potential financial penalties as well. I'll speak about that a bit later. The proposed process for this is that the trade union would request access. Now, this request must include specific information and be in a prescribed format, which will be detailed in secondary legislation. The employer then responds. The current proposal is that that would be within 15 working days, and they can either agree or object to access. There's a 25 working days negotiation period as well, and that gives the employer and the union time to look at what access will look like in practice and to reach an agreement on that. The timescales can be extended, but only by mutual agreement of the parties, and of course, as Matt said earlier on, subject to the final regulations and the final code of practice guidance, because this information is right as of today's date. If access is agreed, terms are notified to CAC to record the agreement, and the CAC would be able to hear complaints and breaches of these terms. So moving on to if no agreement is reached. So if an employer rejects or negotiations fail, either the union or the employer can refer to the CAC for a decision on whether access should be granted. The time limit currently proposed for referral to the CAC is 15 working days from the end of the negotiation period. That was that 25 days. After that, no CAC approach is possible on that access request unless the CAC decides it's reasonable to extend the timescale by a further 15 days. That said, a trade union can always re-request access. If access is agreed between the union and the employer and lodged with the CAC for recording purposes, or if the CAC decide to grant access, then the CAC has the authority to hear complaints about any breaches of those access agreements, and that's by either party. And this also includes a breach caused by a third-party client. So, for example, a third party won't let a union on its premises where the employer's workers are based. A classic example of this, and a common one, would be a cleaning contract where the workers work in a client organisation building. The CAC will have the power to fine for non-compliance of their instruction to correct a breach. So if a union approaches the CAC informing of a breach and the CAC provides a remedy as to how that should be resolved, if an employer still does not put it right, then the CAC can look at fines. And these are really fairly robust fines. So for a first offence, it's a fine of up to £75,000. That increases all the way up to £150,000 for a second offence, and right up to £500,000 for repeat offences. The decision to define will depend on the CAC determination of all the different factors, of course, of a particular situation, and would be in line with the final regulations. The CAC will also have some discretion when determining whether reasonable access should take place or not. Their decision will be subject to consideration of principles and circumstances that are set out in the Act, which considers the needs of both employers and unions. And within the draft code, it appears that rejection of access can only really take place where there are very exceptional circumstances, such as risks related to national security and detection or prevention of crime. So, if a union is to approach MI5, there might be a hurdle in the way there in terms of access. The government consulted on the practicalities of rights of access, and that closed back on the 18th of December 2025. And it included all the options the government favoured, but also alternatives that it invited comments on. Further consultation is still underway on a code of practice on the new statutory access framework, and that's currently live. So it's closing a week today on the 20th of May. So if you want to add your comments, we will provide a link that you can have a look at if you want to provide your input to that consultation. After the 20th of May, then, it's expected there'll be a final code of practice and regulations to follow. Within the draft code of practice, reasonable access is currently proposed as often as once per week. And I guess it depends on, a union's resources as to whether that's something that they would want to implement. There's a maximum 2-year lifespan on access arrangements once in place. So at the end of that, it would be back to the negotiating table. Of course, again, with the caveat, what makes it into the final code of practice is dependent on the consultation outcome. So looking at ACAS views on trade union rights to access, as I said at the start, this is a new, never seen before right conferred upon unions, and it really is a significant shift in industrial landscape for independent trade unions. We believe it will be welcomed by trade unions for obvious reasons, and we think it will be challenging for employers, especially those who don't have relationships with trade unions currently and they don't work with them. ACAS has run this webinar as well with employer groups, and we also offer employers a separate course on collaborative working with trade unions to help them prepare for the changes. At ACAS, we believe the rights to access will likely be a precursor to recognition requests and potentially CAC applications, which ACAS helps support. But it also has an opportunity for employers and unions to really set off on a good foot, to build and maintain constructive collective relations. And looking at employer responses to this, we said it's going to be challenging for employers most likely. And the responses are probably going to depend on their own experiences and access to sound industrial relations advice. As well, the nature of the approach from the trade union would probably have an impact on their reaction to it, alongside the type and frequency of access requested of them. So having worked in individual conciliation in the past, what is deemed as reasonable can be wildly a different interpretation depending on a person's own experience and perceptions. ACAS, as Matt said, will be available to help parties navigate this new terrain to reach agreements, whether that's via facilitated negotiations and collective conciliation or as confidential advice and guidance. So, as promised, here is a link. We will be sharing the slides with you, but it's here. We can also pop it in the chat if you want to add your comments to the consultation. Like I say, there's just a week left. We've got until the 20th of May for that. And finally, where to find us. So we are but two in Scotland. We have Jane Fleming, my colleague, her details are on screen there. And we have myself, Marie Young, my details are there. We do have good relations with full-time officers at trade unions, and they come back to us time and again. If you don't use us, please do feel to reach out, pick up the phone, give us a buzz, and we'd be really happy to hear from you. If for whatever reason, although you're in this STUC and based in Scotland webinar, you're outside of the region, then you can access our collective conciliation service on our website as well, which is just acas.org, and our customer service details are on there, and that will be referred across to us appropriately. So thanks very much for listening to me. I hope I've not had too much of a monotone. And yeah, I'll hand you back to Linda to look at any questions that you might have.
Thanks very much, Marie. That was excellent. And I think it just brings together some of the earlier stuff around, once you get to that stage, how do we actually get in and try and move on from there? We have got one question here, which we can maybe just take, that came in from Lorna Robertson. Does 25-day negotiation periods start at the end of 15 working day response period or run alongside it? It sounds like quite a long time for gaining access if it can be drawn out 3 weeks and then another 5 weeks. What's your understanding of that?
If I were an employer and I just wanted to keep you waiting, I would only respond at the end of the 15 working days, and I would offer you some negotiation. After 2 days, the employer responds and says, "Okay, we can talk about this." That will be the end of the response period because the employer's responded. You enter the negotiation period.
Excellent. Okay, thank you for that. I mean, I think, Marie, as well, reflecting on what you said, the changes that are coming, we will have employers that are going to be dragged into this kicking and screaming, and I think people on this call will be able to identify them now and have probably got their maps out there and got the pins in the maps and got the hot spots that they know. So, and there'll be people that will be saying, look, this has been a long time coming. So some employers will be chucking in the towel saying we can do it. And also, Matt, I do know there are some unions that have gathered up their recognition requests and kind of said, look, why don't we just wait another few weeks until this legislation kicks on, and then we might be in a different position where we can begin to take this forward, So I don't think we've got any other questions.
I can see one there, Linda.
Quickly. Oh, I see it now. Yeah.
Is so
Tick
Chris
that
is
last
asking,
one.
is the right of access undermined? So bearing in mind this is a brand new right. It can be adjudicated on by the CAC, who we know also adjudicates recognition applications, but it is a separate standalone right. Is the right of access undermined if there's an existing union? Now, I think, Chris, you must mean recognised in that workplace. If there's an existing union that's recognised and you are not recognised, I don't think it's undermined, but I can tell you that the CAC, if you applied to the CAC for access and you're trying to access workers who are already covered by collective bargaining, that will be one of these situations where the CAC can say, we will not award access. We will not award access because we're not going to get involved in adjudicating which union should have the access to these workers. Yeah, so it won't take part in that. So that won't mean the argument's not happening somewhere, but the CAC won't adjudicate on it. Yeah. So is it undermined? No, I think the stable existing recognition agreements is supported by the way the law is written. Yeah, you will not find another union able to access the workers that you are collectively bargaining for through the CAC, at least.
No, that makes sense, Matt. I mean, certainly the legislation was not designed to create more tension or conflict out there,
Yep.
you know. And we know these things often need a bit of negotiating, navigating. It's a lot of history sometimes involved, and sometimes there's brand new sites. So, you know, there's a lot of complexities to it.
Yeah.
I'm going to draw us to a close today because we're just about in time. I'm going to say a huge thanks to our colleagues from ACAS who has been along. If you can just pop into the chat before you leave, I know they've still got about 30 or 5 people on the call. There's a quick poll in there. If you could just chuck into the poll how useful you found this session to do. We might do a more formal follow-up as well. We're also going to be doing some more sessions like this, as I said, over the coming period. We're going to, as part of our programme of Making Rights Real, we're going to do a session on secure work, looking at unfair dismissal and guaranteed hours. And we'll be doing that with Thomson Scotland. We'll be specifically looking at that for sectors where there are shift workers and precarious workers, further in higher education, social care, hospitality, retail, not exclusively for them, but really targeted at where there are very precarious workers. And they've got a lot of new rights to having guaranteed hours. But again, how do you make those rights real? A, if you don't know about them and you don't know how to enforce them, your employer's not willing to do so. So we'll be doing that with Thomson's. We're also going to do some work around digital online balloting. And we've got the TUC Digital Lab coming to help us with that. John Wood. So that will probably be in the autumn. ACAS themselves, I'll be running another session, I think around September, but we'll get the dates out to you, and so will they, which is for full-time officers. They held a very productive and informative session recently where they covered a whole load of ground related to the Employment Rights Act coming in, and also just for officers to come together. And then we'll also be doing another session later on, which is where we say, well, we've got these rights. How do we begin to take that into some form of organising? And we'll be doing a union organising course around from access to action and looking at what we can do with some of the fair work tools that are out there that can actually support us in this as well. So if you want to follow up with us, if you've got any other questions, please let us know. Please submit to the poll. It'll only take a second. It's in the chat at the top of your screen. Click on chat and jump into there. I'll let people go now, but thank you for the feedback. And as I say, thanks to our expert panel that we've had today. We'll be in touch with everybody. We've got everyone's contacts and we'll certainly be promoting the other sessions as we go. So thank you very much and good luck in your recognition agreements. Thanks.